Thank you so much. So, spoiler alert, or long story short, depending on if you're sticking around or if you have to leave early, Esther became the unlikely queen. Her people were saved from certain death, and they all lived happily ever after. But it was never guaranteed to go down like that. Not only was there no guarantee, but it was a highly unlikely outcome to a highly unlikely story. And let me warn you here that this story, the way you may have heard it in churches in other places, may have been a little bit sanitized. We will again be using some words that you don't hear in church very often to tell this story faithfully. See, what had happened was the Persian king Ahasuerus had just had his queen banished. We don't know exactly what that means, where she was sent away to, whether or not that is a relatively mess-free euphemism for something much more permanent. We only know that he had ordered her gone, and so gone she was. And from the information that we are given, her only infraction had been that she had finally had enough of being his trophy, his favorite sex slave, and had had the audacity to say, nope, not tonight. When toward the end of a 7-day-long drunken party, the all sheets to the wind king had ordered servants to go fetch her, Queen Vashti, to entertain his lascivious and equally inebriated guests. Now, this week-long party was at the end of a 180-day visit from all of the political elite of the land and all the many, many women of the king's harem, including and maybe especially the queen, were tired. And it is left to our imaginations as to why. So she was immediately disappeared for her lack of compliance without due process to an undisclosed location. So, with Queen Vashti gone, the king had a dangerously bruised ego and suddenly a prime opening in his harem. And so, because absolute power corrupts absolutely, he listened to a lot of power-hungry advisors, and they came up with a plan to gather young women from all over the kingdom and add them to his cloistered and very much enslaved harem of women. It seems that a posse of men literally went out into the streets of all the provinces of the kingdom and just started collecting as many pretty girls and women as they could find, asking them no questions about their lives and the families and friends that they were being forced to leave without notice. They just took them if they were deemed attractive enough and young enough. And among the young women picked up in this gathering of female human property was a young Jewish woman named Esther. She was already enslaved. Her people had been brought to the land in chains already. Her parents had been long dead, and she was being raised by her cousin, Mordecai, also enslaved. So oppression upon oppression. This young enslaved woman is taken from her home, from the only family that she has left, and shoved roughly with countless other bewildered and despairing young women into the courts of the king to be groomed for a different kind of slavery. And it just so happens that Esther's physical appearance allows her to pass for Persian if she chooses to. Out of terror, no doubt, Esther says nothing of her Jewish heritage and goes with the flow and tries to simply survive. And on the outside of the palace walls, having traveled from his home to be as close to Esther as possible because he has made a vow to always take care of her, cousin Mordecai sits in mourning in the traditional sackcloth and ashes. A year passes. Outside the walls, the world for the enslaved Jews is falling apart even more than it was before because their captivity, which for years had been seen by the Persians as good for the kingdom's economy and morale, had started to turn a little sour. And Persians in power were beginning to blame the Jewish people for all that was wrong in their world, as though the oppressed could ever have even been responsible. But for reasons really unspecified, other than pride and anger about personal grievances, that sounds too familiar, Men in positions of power were calling for the death of all of the oppressed, enslaved class, in this case, the Jews. Meanwhile, cousin Mordecai has come to the walls of the palace every day to be as close to his beloved Esther as he can, and has lived in sackcloth and ashes, and has gotten on the very last nerve of some of the powerful people who were tired of him being a constant wailing eyesore and their nice fancy Capitol boulevards, perhaps with protest signs and bullhorns. They were tired of him. Meanwhile, again, inside the palace walls, in harem living quarters, Esther has had an eventful year. She had become the unlikely favorite of the king, and he had chosen her to be his queen. And Esther, because she was pretty interested in not being hanged, they were literally building gallows all over the nation for the express purpose of killing her entire race of people. She kept quiet about her Jewish ethnicity and kept on passing for Persian, as Mordecai kept his vigil outside the wall. He kept sending her messages as often as he could that he loved her. He was working without ceasing to secure her safety. And he sent them via the cadre of eunuchs who served inside the palace, but came and went with more freedom than the women. Here's an interesting thing about the eunuchs. They were an entire class of enslaved men, given more freedom than the enslaved women, but not by much. But they were men who mostly had been forced into genital mutilation before puberty, rendering them feminized, sterile, more docile, less physically strong than most other men, and ostensibly more easily controlled. They not only served themselves as sex slaves on occasion, but they were in charge of taking care of the harem of women. They were essentially a created third gender, a very visible genderqueer population of their day. Some accounts indicate that one of the many reasons for their forced gender blurring surgeries was to make it so that they were shunned by family that they did have and unable to create more, thereby easier to get rid of with no one left to ask questions if they caused any trouble. Now, let me be very clear that although the parallels are worth drawing, I am not with any part of my soul suggesting that our genderqueer and trans beloveds have been forced into anything for nefarious purposes where their healthcare is concerned, because we know that the opposite of allowing them to be who they are is much more likely to happen here now. This is an aside worth noting and making central because you are valid no matter where you fall on the glorious non-binary gender spectrum. Whether you choose to celebrate tomorrow's day of visibility by being out and proud, or not unlike our Esther, it's safer for you to remain private about your truth. You are whole and wholly loved exactly the way you are. Let us be clear about that. Back to the story then. So it was these eunuchs, these precious, beloved, feminized, genderqueer men who, I am not kidding, were put in charge of the cosmetology program of the harem. Yes, they were. They took care of the skincare, the wardrobe, and the hair and makeup needs of the women. You know, they did not teach us this part of the story in Pentecostal Sunday school. But that's what happened. And so the messages were passed between the enslaved Jews and the enslaved women via the enslaved genderqueer men. And Mordecai's delivered message to Esther was exactly this from the book of Esther, chapter 4, beginning in verse 13. Do not think that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silence at such a time as this, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another quarter, but you and your father's family will perish. Who knows? Perhaps you have been brought into the kingdom for just such a time as this. Who knows? I love it that Mordecai never once mentioned a calling from God. Never once. In fact, Esther is the most humanist book in Jewish and in Christian scripture with not one single mention of God in the entire thing. None whatsoever. If Mordecai was a God-fearing Jew and not just Jewish by ethnicity only, he might not have been on speaking terms with the Lord right about then. Elohim had not seemed to be doing very much for his people. And so Mordecai told Esther, here's the thing, beloved, who knows? We have no idea if this will work. But we sure as heck know that keeping silent isn't going to get us anywhere good, right? And maybe, there's at least a chance. Maybe you can do something to help yourself and to save your people if you use the gifts that you have been given in this horrible place that you did not choose. And speak up. Esther did not choose to be queen, y'all. That was a fancy title for a prime sex slave. Esther didn't choose to be the king's favorite. Who knows what becoming the favorite of a man like that even entailed for Esther? She didn't ask for any of this, and she had no obligation whatsoever to put her neck on the line and ask the king for any favors. She knew, as did everyone else, from Queen Vashti's example, what could happen to anyone, even the queen, if you caught the king in the foul mood, or your loyalty was in question, or you bruised his ego. No one voluntarily went before the king to take that risk. But who knows, Esther? And at this point, what do you have to lose? And so after receiving her beloved cousin Mordecai's messages, Esther deeply considered her options, which were not many, shrugged and said, if I perish, I perish. But I'll do it. I'll do it. I'll go talk to the king. So that's what she did. She used the only power that women had to use, her beauty and her body. And she made sure that the king wanted her and her alone to keep coming back again and again, night after night, until one night she finally mustered up all of her courage to tell him before he fell into sleep, listen, the people who you are leaning toward calling for the genocide of, they're my people. They're me. And if my people are killed, I will be killed with them because I am a Jew. Sweetheart, I know that you're very busy, but do you think maybe as a favor to your wife, you might just consider calling the whole thing off? And I know that in all of our hearts are with Palestinians and Ukrainians and the Sudanese, etc., to whom this horror is happening right now, and the nuance and the cognitive dissonance and the divisions among nations and cultures and families about who sides with whom in light of the history we all know, it's hard to bear. That's also worth acknowledging here today. But what happened in this story, in the story of Esther, is that when she asked the king for a ceasefire, he listened. He did it. And then the story goes on quite interestingly and karmically appropriate from there. And because of Esther's courage, her people were spared genocide that time around. But man, that could have gone a whole lot of ways, couldn't it? There was a power grab. There was a political upheaval happening and a powder keg of oppression happening right inside the king's palace, as well as throughout the whole land. There were queer slaves and female slaves, both categorically denied reproductive choice, by the way, and slaves being persecuted for their religion, their ethnicity, and their culture all at once. And there were intersections of people who fell into more than one of those categories. And no one had a guarantee of any kind of positive outcome. But they all knew that somebody had to do something. They were dying. Their loved ones were literally being disappeared off the streets by plainclothes so-called police, perhaps. Nobody could have made a difference without the support of one another. I wonder, beloveds, where we might fit into the powder keg of oppression happening inside our beautiful palaces. I wonder about our own intersections of privilege and oppression that bind us together and keep us apart. I wonder about the transgender children who cannot get their medications in many states already, my state among them. And those restrictions will surely tighten in months to come. I wonder about the women and the trans men and the non-binary womb-having people in many states already, my state among them, being denied access to reproductive health care, and those restrictions will surely tighten in the months to come. I wonder about the precious Jewish folks who are being targeted by anti-Semitism, even as they scream not in our names, in solidarity with the precious Palestinian people of Gaza. And those attacks will surely grow in months to come. I wonder what our beloved, complicated, frightened nation is going to do about anything and everything. And those answers will surely change in the months to come. And I wonder, I bet you do too, how is this all going to end? I wonder, who knows? Maybe even though we didn't ask for any of this, I know how y'all voted. We didn't ask for any of this. I wonder if maybe we are here, right now for such a time as this. And I wonder if it will be our interdependence on one another that makes the difference. It wasn't only Esther's courageous choice. It was a coalition of people who helped her find her courage, prepare and hone her gifts, and walk boldly into that chamber of the king. Esther was not empowered ever by others in positions of power, but by others in intersecting positions of subjugation and oppression. I know that you all, Martha's Vineyard, you folks, you've already done a whole lot of work to be the change you want to see in the world. I heard it in some of your sharing today. I know that you've done that work, and you just keep showing up and doing it. I know that. And there was a time for us to rise as one with our LGBTQIA siblings and demand equality in law, and we did that, and here we are again. We have worked tirelessly for generations for the rights of women, for reproductive choice, and for a place of unequivocal equality at the table. And here we are again. We have risen in solidarity time and time again with our Muslim and our Jewish siblings and said we worship the same source and all love is one love. And here we are again. And so right here, right now, for a body of believers in love and in each other who have tried for so long to get so many things right despite all the odds, who knows? Perhaps we were brought into the conversation for such a time as this. For a time when organizers for reproductive choice and trans rights and immigrant rights might need a safe place to hold some meetings. For a time when reputable organizations need real, tangible support for endangered people, the kind of support with dollar signs attached to it. For such a time as this, when perhaps we, with our own intersections of privilege and oppression, all bundled together not so neatly, might be called to be the messengers between the wall outside and behind the harem curtain. To open up our own WhatsApp or Signal channels for encrypted communication, for an underground network of safety and mutual aid. It is time. And maybe, folks, maybe we are not called to be the ones leading the charge, but the ones heating up the bathwater for the one who's about to step out in front of the king and put it all on the line. The ones saying to predominantly BIPOC and queer organizations, here, use our worship space to organize your rally. We'll provide snacks and water and art supplies for your signs. How else can we help? So, what gifts, maybe even unlikely ones you didn't choose at all, can you bring to such a time as this? Can I tell you the truth? Sometimes it's hard for me to know. I really just most days want to sit and weep and listen to someone who lives inside of a Black, brown, queer, or disabled body get up in our pulpits, because I'm not sure what a cisgender US American white woman has to add to this fight. But for such a time as this, right here, right now, I still have my voice. I still have my promise To those of you who are in the fight because your circumstances don't give you any choice in the matter, that you do not stand alone. We, beloveds, have this choice right now. We can say loud and clear that Palestinians and Ukrainians and the Yemenis and the Sudanese are our human family. We can let trans kids and all womb-having people know that they are whole and holy and have a right to bodily autonomy and are worthy of our fiercest protection. We can still say that Black lives matter and that Indigenous rights are the true laws of the land we live on, and that immigration is natural and necessary, and that no human being is an alien. We can still resist and say not on our watch to the very real threat of fascism taking our democracy from us. Who knows? There never was a mention of God or a calling or a sure victory, or an outcome that would make any of this seem at all worthwhile. But that's the story of life, isn't it? And we live in anyway. If I perish, I perish. I mean, I will eventually anyway, right? But what about right now? What if maybe we are called to the kingdom for just such a time as this? What if it is your gift that changes the heart of someone in power? Maybe. It could happen, and it wouldn't be a precedent. May we listen to the callings of all our souls. May we truly live into those callings with whatever time we have left. May we be fully present right here, right now. May we live and love fiercely, like people with nothing left to lose. But oh, with every beautiful thing that we can imagine together to gain. May it be so. May we be the ones who make it so. Ashe and Amen.